There are stories that haunt you, that burrow deep in your chest and sit there like a weight you can't shake. Not because they're full of blood or horror, but because they're quiet, calculated, carried out by people who should have protected. And that's what this story is. It begins on a warm summer night in Florida, June 27, 2025. The sort of night where palm fronds barely move and the air is thick with humidity. In the quiet suburb of El Portal, just north of Miami, emergency services received a chilling 911 call from a woman, claiming her 4-year-old daughter was missing. Within minutes, they were rushing to a modern vacation rental tucked behind manicured hedges and a turquoise pool. The woman on the phone was Dr. Neha Gupta, 36 years old, a pediatrician by profession. But when first responders arrived, nothing about the scene aligned with what a medical professional, let alone a mother, might do. Dr. Gupta claimed she had woken up around 3:30 a.m. to a strange sound. She said she discovered that the sliding glass door to the patio was open, wide open, and her daughter, Aria, was missing. She told dispatchers that she'd searched the house in a panic before spotting her child submerged at the bottom of the rental's backyard pool. Gupta insisted she dove in, despite not knowing how to swim, and tried to revive the child for 10 full minutes before calling 911. That's what she said. But none of it would hold up to scrutiny. The scene. When EMS pulled up that night, they found Aria, unresponsive, limp, and cool to the touch, in the deep end of the pool. There were no frantic screams from a mother, no wet towels on the floor, no signs of a genuine attempt at resuscitation. Emergency workers administered CPR and rushed the little girl to Jackson Memorial Hospital, but less than an hour later, she was gone. To them, it initially looked like a tragic accident. Drownings in Florida aren't rare, especially with toddlers. But there was something strange in how calm Gupta seemed. Detached. She gave her version of events in short, clinical sentences. And while others wept, she observed. Within 48 hours, the autopsy report changed everything. What the autopsy revealed. The Miami-Dade County Medical Examiner released a preliminary report that dismantled Dr. Gupta's timeline, her story, and her credibility piece by piece. First, no water was found in Aria's lungs or stomach. That's significant. When a child drowns, even if they stop breathing quickly, there's usually at least a trace of water intake. But Aria's lungs were dry. Her stomach was empty too, raising questions about Gupta's claim that the child ate dinner just hours before her death. But it got worse. The exam found bruises on Aria's cheeks, cuts inside her mouth, indicators that someone had forcefully smothered her. These weren't the result of a fall, or CPR, or flailing in water. These were deliberate injuries. This wasn't an accident. This was a setup. Who was Dr. Neha Gupta? To understand how this unfolded, you have to go back not to Florida, but to Oklahoma City, where Dr. Neha Gupta lived and worked. By all accounts, she was a brilliant, ambitious pediatrician. She held an academic post as an assistant professor at the University of Oklahoma College of Medicine, and she treated children at Oklahoma Children's Hospital. But behind the polished resume was a crumbling personal life. Court records show that Gupta had been suspended from patient care weeks before Aria's death. Her termination was formally scheduled for May 30, 2025, a month before the trip to Florida. She was unemployed, her reputation tarnished, and the pressure was mounting. She was also embroiled in a nasty custody battle with her ex-husband, Dr. Sohrab Talathi. The two had divorced in 2024, but the war between them was far from over. Legal filings reveal ongoing disputes over child custody, attorney's fees, and over $79,000 in court-ordered payments she was struggling to make. Sohrab told investigators something that changed the trajectory of the case. He didn't even know Neha had taken Aria out of state. That alone could be considered a violation of the custody agreement. But more alarming was the motive it hinted at. Gupta had previously filed for sole custody and failed. She had even filed for a protective order against Sohrab, which was later dismissed. He, in turn, had raised concerns about her mental health and requested psychiatric evaluations during the custody hearings, though it's still unclear whether those were ever completed. So when Neha Gupta packed her bags and drove Aria over 1,000 miles to a short-term rental in El Portal on June 25, 2 days before the child died, no one was watching, no one knew. And in the silence of that isolation, something happened. A vacation that wasn't. Court documents and surveillance video confirmed that Neha and Aria were the only occupants of the Airbnb rental. Gupta told police that on June 26, the day before the incident, they went to the beach and rode jet skis, fun, carefree activities that sounded like a typical mother-daughter vacation. But investigators couldn't verify many of these details. She claimed they returned home between 7 and 8 p.m. and that she woke Aria up at 9 p.m. for dinner. That one sentence unraveled her story further. Why wake a 4-year-old for dinner after a full day of activities? Why not let her sleep? And more importantly, why was Aria's stomach completely empty at the time of death? The evidence mounts. Investigators began to dissect Gupta's version of events and found inconsistencies everywhere. The sliding glass door, which Gupta claimed was found open when she woke up, showed no signs of forced entry. There were no footprints or wet towels, no indicators that Aria had wandered outside on her own. Gupta's phone history and movements didn't align with her call timeline. Surveillance footage from the neighborhood didn't show Aria walking outside, only the quiet of the backyard, the pool reflecting moonlight. And then came the moment that changed the case entirely. On July 1, just days after the autopsy was released, police in Oklahoma City acted swiftly on a warrant. With the help of U.S. Marshals, they raided a home and found Dr. Neha Gupta hiding in a laundry room. Body cam footage would later show her emerging in handcuffs, surrounded by armed officers, her eyes glassy, her face unreadable. The charge? First-degree murder. The motive? Authorities believe it was revenge, control, or desperation, possibly all three. With custody slipping away and her career in shambles, Gupta may have chosen to end the one relationship she could still control. Her daughters. The public reaction. Back in Florida, the community of El Portal was stunned. Vacation homes in the area are rarely associated with crime scenes, let alone infanticide. The media dubbed the case the drowning that wasn't. True crime enthusiasts on YouTube and TikTok dissected every frame of the arrest footage. Reddit threads overflowed with speculation and armchair psychology. But among the noise, one fact remained horrifyingly simple. A 4-year-old girl was gone, and the person accused of taking her life was the very person meant to protect it. As of late July 2025, Dr. Neha Gupta remains held without bond in Miami-Dade County Jail. She is scheduled to appear in court on August 7, and prosecutors have made it clear they will pursue this case as premeditated homicide. Because for them and for the medical examiner, for the responding officers, and for Aria's father, this was never a drowning. It was a murder, hidden in plain sight. After the autopsy results cast doubt over every word Dr. Neha Gupta had spoken, the wheels of justice moved quickly. Detectives were no longer circling theories. They had settled on a single, horrifying conclusion. The poolside drowning was a cover-up. And what really happened to 4-year-old Aria Talathi was far more sinister. By June 30, 2025, investigators armed with mounting forensic evidence, contradictory statements, and a timeline that no longer made sense, petitioned for a first-degree murder warrant. Their language was chilling and direct. As the sole caregiver at the time of death, Neha Gupta intentionally caused the death of her daughter and took calculated steps to make it appear accidental. It didn't take long for that warrant to travel across state lines. The next morning, on July 1, in Edmond, Oklahoma, a quiet suburban neighborhood known for its orderly lawns and family-friendly cul-de-sacs, a convoy of U.S. Marshals and Oklahoma City police pulled up in front of Dr. Gupta's house. But what happened next wasn't the kind of knock and talk one might expect for someone with no prior record, no known history of violence, and a career in medicine. It was a tactical raid, loud, forceful, and captured entirely on body-worn cameras. A morning raid in suburbia. The timestamp on the footage, released weeks later, reads 7:41 a.m. The footage begins with a dozen officers staging outside a well-kept brick home, speaking in clipped, practiced voices. "Neha Gupta, come to the front door. This is the U.S. Marshals." They shout it again louder. There's no response. Seconds later, the battering ram is raised. The front door crashes open, and boots pound down the hardwood floor. Officers fan out through the halls, weapons drawn, shouting commands, clearing each room like a military operation. Inside, the house is still, too still. A flat-screen TV glows faintly from a living room stand. A child's toy tea set sits on a low table, frozen in time. Officers sweep through the kitchen, a nursery, the master bedroom, and then they reach the laundry room. She's there. Curled behind the door, partially obscured by a hamper, is Dr. Neha Gupta. She doesn't resist. She doesn't speak. They instruct her to get on the floor. She complies. A female officer grabs her arms and cuffs her wrists behind her back. The body cam footage captures the silence that follows. For a few seconds, no one speaks. Then, one officer breaks the tension. "You have the right to remain silent." They lead her down the hallway, past the child's toy set, past the open front door, and out into the blinding Oklahoma sun. Gupta looks dazed, expressionless. Not panicked, not angry, just gone. Like her mind was still somewhere else, or nowhere at all. The legal fallout begins. Later that afternoon, as news of the arrest broke, media trucks swarmed the quiet Edmond Street. Neighbors stared from porches. Some shook their heads. Others whispered theories. Back in Miami, the headlines were already erupting. Mother accused of staging drowning in Florida vacation rental. Pediatrician arrested in daughter's mysterious death. But in Oklahoma, Gupta's defense attorney, Richard L. Cooper, quickly began shaping the other side of the story. At a hastily arranged press briefing, Cooper addressed the press directly. This was not a criminal hiding from law enforcement. This was a terrified woman who thought someone was breaking into her home. He claimed that at the exact moment officers burst in, Neha was on the phone with 911, reporting what she believed was a home invasion. According to him, she had been cooperative from the start and had every intention of complying with investigators. What happened to Dr. Gupta this morning was excessive, traumatic, and unwarranted. She is not a flight risk. She is not a danger. She is a grieving mother. But the state of Florida disagreed. They had already filed their charging documents in Miami-Dade County, accusing Gupta of premeditated first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and misleading investigators. Behind the legal jargon was a narrative that prosecutors believed they could prove. Gupta brought Aria to Florida alone. Despite ongoing custody litigation, she killed her child in a premeditated act. Likely by smothering, she staged a fake drowning to mislead authorities. She waited long enough to make sure resuscitation would fail, then finally called 911. A community left in shock. Back in Edmond, colleagues at the University of Oklahoma College of Medicine, where Gupta had recently been placed on suspension, issued a short statement acknowledging her arrest and expressing sorrow for the loss of Aria. Among neighbors and friends, reactions were mixed. Some remembered Neha as poised, brilliant, occasionally intense, but deeply involved in her daughter's life. One neighbor recalled Aria riding her scooter in the driveway just weeks before the trip to Florida. She was sweet, shy. She stuck close to her mom, the neighbor said. It's hard to imagine anything like this. But others weren't surprised to hear that something had gone terribly wrong. One family friend, who asked not to be named, said, "She was under an insane amount of pressure work, the custody stuff, money problems. I think she was unraveling for a while." That unraveling is something prosecutors were also trying to trace. Court records showed that Gupta had fallen behind on legal fees and expenses connected to the custody fight. Her former employer had placed her on administrative leave, and her attempts to gain sole custody had repeatedly failed. She was ordered to pay thousands in support, and sources close to the case said she had become obsessed with being Aria's only parent. To many watching from the outside, it painted a chilling portrait, a mother whose world was closing in, and who made a final, fatal decision to reclaim control. Cooper fights back. Still, Cooper remained unshaken in his public defense of Neha Gupta. In interviews and filings, he called the charges absurd, describing his client as a brilliant physician who loved her daughter deeply. He pushed back against every point of the prosecution's timeline. No eyewitness saw Gupta harm Aria. The child's cause of death was still awaiting full confirmation from final toxicology. Her actions during and after the incident showed panic, not malice. And Gupta's lack of a criminal record, paired with a prestigious medical career, made it unthinkable that she would harm her own child. But the evidence was mounting, and public opinion was beginning to harden. Held without bond, by July 3, Neha Gupta had been extradited to Florida, where she appeared briefly in a Miami-Dade courtroom. Dressed in a beige jumpsuit, she said little during the hearing. The judge denied bond. Given the nature of the charge and the disturbing evidence presented, the court cannot release the defendant at this time. Outside the courthouse, Aria's father, Dr. Sohrab Talathi, issued a short statement through his attorney. Aria was the light of my life. She deserved love, safety, and a full life. I trusted the court system to protect her. I never imagined this. By the time Dr. Neha Gupta was marched in handcuffs through the fluorescent corridors of the Oklahoma County Detention Center, her face was already familiar to millions. News outlets from Florida to New York were replaying her arrest footage. Her once pristine medical credentials, pediatrician, assistant professor, children's health advocate, were now footnotes. What dominated headlines was her new title: accused murderer. She had been charged with the first-degree premeditated murder of her 4-year-old daughter, Aria Talathi. But the arrest in Edmond, Oklahoma, wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Fleeing or frozen, the legal spin begins. In the days following her July 1 arrest, prosecutors in both Oklahoma and Florida made it clear they considered Gupta a flight risk, not because she had purchased tickets to leave the country or crossed borders, but because of what they called conscious evasion. They pointed to her silence when police shouted from outside her Edmond home, her hiding in the laundry room, and her decision to remain out of public reach following her daughter's death. That, they said, wasn't the behavior of a grieving mother. That was the behavior of someone avoiding prosecution. So she was booked in Oklahoma first, under a secondary charge, fleeing to avoid prosecution. From there, the legal machinery kicked into high gear. Extradition papers were filed, hearings were waived, and by mid-July, Dr. Neha Gupta was shackled and transported to Miami-Dade County, where the true weight of the charges awaited. Booked in Miami, the face of a felony case. On July 18, Dr. Gupta was formally booked into the Turner Guilford Night Correctional Center, one of the largest jails in South Florida. Inside the facility, beneath its gray walls and fluorescent flicker, she was just another inmate. No title, no white coat, just a case number and a murder charge that carried the weight of a potential life sentence without parole. Prosecutors came out swinging. In court filings, they highlighted the discrepancies in Gupta's story as the linchpin of their argument. She claimed Aria ate dinner at 9 p.m., but the autopsy showed an empty stomach. She said she tried to resuscitate Aria for 10 full minutes, yet the medical examiner found no water in the lungs. She said she couldn't swim, but allegedly jumped into a deep pool and performed solo rescue efforts for nearly a quarter of an hour. And most damning, the injuries inside Aria's mouth and the bruises on her cheeks, which weren't caused by water, but pressure and force. Prosecutors argued these contradictions weren't small. They were fatal. During her bond hearing, the presiding judge agreed. This court finds that the combination of forensic inconsistencies, the delayed 911 call, and the absence of a coherent explanation from the defense amount to strong probable cause. The defendant will remain held without bond. It was a blow to Gupta's legal team, but it also crystallized their strategy. The defense mounts its counterattack. Backed into a corner, Gupta's attorneys move to shift the narrative. If prosecutors were painting her as a calculating killer, they intended to repaint her as a woman on the brink, someone deeply wounded, emotionally devastated, and misunderstood. Their first act? Plead not guilty. Their second? Begin building a counter-narrative that questioned the reliability of the medical examiner, the assumptions behind the autopsy, and the emotional context surrounding Aria's death. Lead defense attorney Richard L. Cooper, a seasoned trial lawyer with a reputation for turning complex medical cases into jury confusion, laid out the early framework in public statements and legal motions. We are seeking an independent autopsy and consulting with forensic experts. There are multiple possibilities that haven't been fully explored. He hinted at what's likely to become the defense's central strategy. Challenge the autopsy findings, specifically the interpretation of mouth injuries as evidence of smothering. Argue that mental health factors stemming from divorce, job loss, and financial trauma were present, but not indicative of homicidal intent. Emphasize that Gupta gave consistent statements to police and cooperated during questioning. Raise the possibility that the case was rushed to charges without all toxicology, psychological, and scene reconstruction findings completed. To Cooper, this was not a story of murder. It was a story of misinterpretation, misfortune, and grief, weaponized by overzealous prosecutors. An emotional tangle, grief, trauma, and the public eye. As the legal chess match unfolds, the emotional core of the case remains raw. A little girl is dead, and the woman accused of ending her life insists she didn't. The defense has floated the notion that Neha Gupta was experiencing acute mental distress in the weeks before Aria's death. It's a theory supported by court records showing a series of life-altering blows. Her job at Oklahoma Children's Hospital had been terminated. Her attempts to gain sole custody of Aria had failed. She had been ordered to pay $79,000 in legal and support fees. And her professional identity, built over a decade in medicine, was crumbling. Was this the unraveling of a woman who snapped in a moment of despair? Or was it a calculated act designed to eliminate a child she feared losing forever? That's the question the courtroom will be asked to decide. What the jury may hear. Gupta's attorneys have already signaled that mental health will play a central role in their case. It's possible they will bring in psychiatrists to testify about post-divorce trauma, adjustment disorder, situational depression, and possibly psychosomatic dissociation, in which her memory of events may be fragmented or suppressed. But prosecutors are likely to counter that argument with their own expert witnesses, medical examiners, trauma specialists, and first responders who will point to one truth: Aria did not drown, and whatever happened to her happened before she entered that water. The jury may also be shown timelines reconstructed from cell phone pings, security footage, and Gupta's own statements. They may listen to 911 audio, see post-mortem photos, watch the arrest video, where Gupta is pulled from her laundry room, her face blank, and if it goes to trial, they'll be asked to decide. Was this a tragedy or a plan? What happens next? As of now, Dr. Neha Gupta remains in custody at the Turner Guilford Knight Correctional Center. She is listed as non-bondable. Her next court appearance is scheduled for August 7, 2025, where pretrial motions will be heard, and the judge may decide on timelines for expert submissions, mental health evaluations, and discovery deadline. Behind the scenes, both sides are quietly assembling a war chest of witnesses, exhibits, and case law. And across the internet, the case continues to draw attention. True crime podcasts are speculating. YouTube analysts are replaying the inconsistencies in her timeline. Reddit threads buzz with amateur forensic theories. Some say she's guilty and cunning. Others say she's broken and misjudged. But in the middle of all the noise is a single, heartbreaking fact. A child is dead. And somewhere, in the silence between Florida's humid stillness and Oklahoma's suburban quiet, the truth waits to be told. When news of Dr. Neha Gupta's arrest and the chilling autopsy revelations went public, it sparked something neither side of the case could have fully predicted. A fierce, polarized reaction that echoed across Oklahoma, Florida, and beyond, reverberating through diasporic communities and true crime circles alike. A diaspora in disbelief. In Oklahoma City, the Indian American community in particular was shaken to its core. Neha Gupta wasn't just a doctor, she was one of their own. A woman many had admired for holding dual roles as physician and academic, contributing to children's health, visible at temple gatherings, charitable fundraisers, and community events. Lines in WhatsApp groups and Facebook pages brimmed with messages like, "Neha was always so kind with kids. I still can't believe this is her." A sense of collective disbelief and grief took hold. Within that tight-knit fabric, many refused to believe a mother could do such a thing. Her Nava Bala Patel Temple colleagues described her as gentle, attentive during storytelling sessions, especially with young mothers and toddlers. Sayar Mehta, a local school teacher who interacted with Aria and her mother at community picnics, told reporters, "Aria was full of life, bright eyes, hugs for everyone. Neha was proud, so loving. It's impossible to reconcile what they're saying with what we saw." Across the diaspora, many insisted that motherhood and education are deeply respected values that Neha seemed to embody. That cultural loyalty, however, was challenged by unsettling forensic details made public. And in homes where respect for elders and non-confrontation are deeply rooted, the lines between defending a sister in culture and assessing raw evidence felt like a painful tension, evidence that shook the narrative. Meanwhile, others saw those forensic breakthroughs as undeniable proof that the case was not a coincidence. Prosecutors emphasized three triad pillars of contradiction. 1. Dry lungs and empty stomach. A genuine drowning, especially in a child, is almost always marked by traces of water in the lungs or stomach. Aria had neither. 2. Bruising and oral trauma. Cuts inside her mouth and pressure bruises to her cheeks suggested violent force, something very inconsistent with slipping underwater or drowning. 3. Delayed 911 call with no resuscitation evidence. Authorities question how a self-proclaimed non-swimmer could enter a pool for 10 full minutes without immediate crisis, especially when no towels, flotation devices, or wet areas were found inside the house. Public supporters of the prosecution argued these facts alone were textbook disqualifiers for the drowning storyline and demanded justice for Aria Talathi. Legal commentary and analysts take sides. As the case gained coverage in legal circles and true crime forums, the narrative split again. One side raised concerns. Did investigators move too fast? Were alternative causes of the bruising overlooked? Could an independent forensic review offer a different interpretation? Legal scholars tweeted questions about due process and forensic confirmation bias. Unless full toxicology and histology reports are in, how can we be sure? The case seems rushed. A criminal defense attorney noted. Custody battle watchers pointed to a well-known pattern. High-stakes family disputes sometimes escalate into tragedies. But they also emphasized motive, especially one rooted in emotional desperation, is not the same as premeditation in the eyes of the law. The opposing narrative focused on objective forensic clarity. The medical examiner's preliminary report was emphatic. Aria was dead before entering the pool. The drowning was staged. Experts on forensic pathologies reiterated that pressure, bruises, and internal soft tissue hemorrhages inside a child's mouth typically result from non-accidental trauma, not CPR or falls. Analysts projected the likelihood prosecutors would successfully argue premeditation given the time frame between claimed events and emergency call. Mental health advocates weigh in. Amid the polarized mix, mental health professionals saw the tragedy differently. Letters of op-ed and social media posts questioned whether a moment of psychological breakdown or depression, shaped by job loss, custody loss, and identity collapse, could explain Gupta's alleged actions. One mental health forum argued, "We've seen cases where intense emotional grief transforms into irrational, harmful behavior, not planned murder. We should consider trauma, not just motive." Psychologists highlighted that adjustment disorder, deep despair, and impulsive dissociative episodes can manifest in tragic behavior even among high-functioning professionals. They didn't excuse violence. They simply wanted the court to consider mitigation, not only guilt. At the same time, critics pointed out a razor-thin line. Trauma might explain a breakdown, but ending a child's life is vastly different from a subconscious dissociative episode. Social media. Rage and sympathy collide. Online reaction was relentless. Forums like Reddit and Facebook hosted thousands of comments. Posts ranged from sympathetic, "Poor woman lost everything, a life destroyed. No sane human could ever survive that kind of pressure," to harsh condemnation. "This is textbook staged drowning. The autopsy findings alone are chilling." Quick turnaround video breakdowns on YouTube, modeled after True Crime Daily, and that chapter spliced together body cam footage, headlines, and medical animation. They often concluded that no ordinary mother could survive those contradictions without deception. Some of the virality came with a sobering side effect: prejudice. A handful of Indian American women noted receipt of threatening DMs and accusatory messages. On the flip side, some accusatory Reddit users wrote, "Don't let cultural sympathy blind you. Facts first," which raised painful questions. Can a community mourn and also demand truth, without turning internal tragedy into tribal allegiance? What the experts say. Several independent legal analysts, reached through email interviews, were quoted in news stories and legal blogs. If the defense presents a legitimate alternative interpretation of the bruising, perhaps dental trauma, or accidental injury during an attempted rescue, it could muddy the prosecution's timeline. Another added, "Ultimately, the jury will weigh two competing expert stories, one rooted in grief with trauma-based explanation, and one rooted in classic forensic homicide indicators." Yet prosecutors remained firm. A criminal trial professor posted, "Unless defense experts are dramatically persuasive, the medical examiner's conclusion that Aria was placed into the pool after death will likely carry overwhelming weight." These dichotomous expert perspectives reflected what many described as the central narrative battle: motive plus opportunity versus unchallengeable forensic science. Culture, custody, and the specter of motive. One aspect that lingered beneath the surface was how family court stress and custody disputes may set fire to tragedy, but don't prove it. In public filings, lawyers pointed to Neha's failed bids for custody and sole parental rights, court orders requiring her to pay $79,000 in legal and child support, alleged non-compliance with psychiatric evaluation requests during divorce hearings, the brief issuance and subsequent dismissal of a protective order filed by Neha against Sohrab. Public watchers observed that while custody conflicts can fuel emotional turmoil, requiring mental health compliance is not an admission of guilt. But skepticism toward Neha's reliability crept into every courtroom filing. This case revived a hard truth. The law requires evidence, not motive, to convict. But motive complicates empathy. The public dialogue so far. As July ticked toward the August 7 court date, the case remained unsolved, but public opinion was far from neutral. Three key voices dominated the conversation. 1. Supporters of Aria and prosecutors. They interpreted the forensic report as irrefutable. Many described stage-set scenes, including the patio door, the empty dinner timing, and the dry lungs as red flags, all aligned. They demanded no bond, full trial, and maximum penalty if proven guilty. 2. Supporters of Gupta. They urged caution. They pointed to systemic flaws, rushed charges, media sensationalism, and absence of final lab results. They demanded independent experts, continued presumption of innocence, and consideration of psychological exhaustion under relentless pressure. 3. Mental health advocates. They pressed to differentiate between intentional homicide and tragic breakdown. They called for mental health evaluations, possibly questioning credibility without excusing outcomes. What the court may see next. With August 7 drawing closer, legal teams on both sides were quietly preparing for one critical stage: motion hearings. The prosecution would argue for expert witness testimony from the medical examiner, forensic pathologists specializing in child trauma, possibly aquatic safety experts who can speak to drowning physiology. The defense intends to bring in independent pathologists, psychologists familiar with trauma-induced behavior, a timeline expert to scrutinize phone records, timestamps, and scene reconstructions. They may push for admittance of mental state testimony, how acute stress can alter perception and memory, and how timing delays, like waiting 10 minutes to call 911, could reflect panic or confusion. The judge may be asked to rule on whether the defense can introduce expert interpretations that contradict the initial autopsy, how much of the custody battle and emotional context can be admitted without prejudicing the jury, and whether any portion of the case was prematurely concluded before all toxicology and psychological reports were ready. These hearings will shape what the jury eventually sees or refuses to see in the full trial. When truth is slower than headlines. This case stands as an urgent reminder of how fast headlines travel and how complex truth often lags behind public opinion. Many forums, hashtags, and think pieces are already convinced. Either Neha Gupta is a grieving, misunderstood mother, or she is a calculated killer hiding behind grief. But only one thing is certain for now. The evidence pulls the narrative in conflicting directions, and the legal system will have to unravel the rest. Through it all, Aria is gone, and the only certainty is her silence. By the time the sun had risen on July 26, Dr. Neha Gupta was no longer just a pediatrician or a grieving mother. She was the accused center of a case that had split communities and triggered national debate. The stakes were no longer confined to legal paperwork or sterile courtrooms. They had seeped into living rooms, online forums, cultural gatherings. Her name was on morning news tickers, courtroom blogs, and the front pages of local tabloids. Every detail, her facial expressions, in body cam footage, the faint shadow of a toy behind her as she was handcuffed, the subtle cracks in her voice on the 911 call, was dissected by strangers, trying to make sense of something so utterly senseless. Gupta now awaited arraignment in a Miami-Dade courtroom scheduled for August 7, a proceeding expected to stretch long past a simple plea entry. The prosecution, bolstered by a medical examiner's chilling report, had indicated their intent to call a host of forensic experts who would testify about Aria's injuries. Injuries, they argued, were physically inconsistent with drowning. Among them, signs of facial and neck trauma, bruises in stages of healing, and critically, an absence of water in the lungs. These facts, they said, told a story the defense refused to face. But the defense? They weren't backing down. Led by Richard L. Cooper, an attorney known for defending unpopular defendants in high-profile cases, the strategy became clear: cast doubt, not just on the timeline, but on the science itself. In the coming months, Cooper planned to bring in independent forensic experts to challenge the very assumptions prosecutors were betting on. He argued the bruises could have come from a frantic attempt at CPR, the time delay before the 911 call, a panicked mother trying to save her daughter herself, the dry lungs possibly explained by laryngospasm, a rare reflex that can stop water from entering the lungs during drowning. "We are not here to prove a drowning," Cooper told reporters after her bond hearing was denied. "We are here to prove reasonable doubt. There are multiple scientific explanations for what happened in that apartment, and we intend to present every single one." The court had denied Gupta bond, citing her sudden move to Oklahoma, her silence during parts of the interrogation, and the concerning timeline surrounding her daughter's death. The judge had flagged the inconsistencies as red flag statements about not knowing how to swim, but trying to rescue Aria for nearly 10 minutes. A supposed dinner reservation with digital receipts suggesting otherwise, and perhaps most damning, the calm demeanor that prosecutors claimed didn't match the chaos of a mother finding her child lifeless. But inside the courtroom, Cooper pushed back on every claim. His client, he argued, was being punished not for evidence, but for emotion, or the lack of it. "Grief doesn't look the same for everyone," he said. "This is a woman who lost everything: her daughter, her reputation, her home. She's not a murderer. She's a mother in mourning." What no one could deny was how sharply divided the public had become. Across Oklahoma and in Indian American circles nationwide, the reaction was swift, complex, and deeply personal. Neha Gupta had been, by all accounts, a model citizen, a straight-A student who had gone to medical school in New Jersey, a physician who had volunteered at children's health fairs and free clinics, a mother who had fought hard for full custody of Aria during a messy divorce. There were pictures of them smiling on road trips, at park picnics, in colorful saris during Diwali. To her supporters, the very idea that she would harm her child bordered on madness. "She loved that girl more than anything," said Priya Nanduri, a close friend from medical school who organized a small vigil in Oklahoma City. "I don't understand what happened, but I refuse to believe she killed her. Something else must have gone wrong." But to others, the facts couldn't be ignored. The Airbnb reservation was clear, the timeline shaky, the forensics, according to prosecutors, textbook staging. Aria's tiny stomach was empty, though Gupta had claimed she'd eaten. Her lips were bruised, her face bore signs of what looked like pressure. Online forums buzzed with debates. Was this another case of a parent snapping under pressure, or a rush to judgment fueled by circumstantial evidence and media sensationalism? Legal analysts weighed in with caution, warning that for all the outrage and speculation, this case was far from over. "There's a lot we don't know yet," said Monica Valdez, a former prosecutor turned analyst for Courtwatch. "And while the forensics are compelling, the defense has every right to question them. This isn't a slam dunk. It's going to come down to science, psychology, and motive. And motive is notoriously hard to prove, especially this motive." Gupta's attorneys had already hinted at a different angle: emotional instability, mental health collapse, and the crushing weight of a life unraveling. She had lost her hospital job 3 months prior. Her finances were strained. She had just come out of a bitter custody battle. And Aria, her daughter, had become the emotional anchor to everything she was still holding on. Did she snap? Or did something else happen entirely? Some in the mental health advocacy world were quick to weigh in, urging the public and the court not to jump to punitive conclusions without fully examining Gupta's psychological state. Grief, stress, depression, they can warp reality, said Dr. Jenna Hart, a clinical psychologist based in Miami. People in extreme emotional distress sometimes make irrational decisions. It doesn't excuse anything, but it complicates the narrative. Indeed, Gupta's legal team seemed poised to argue exactly that this was not the calculated act of a cold-blooded killer, but a breakdown, a spiraling, a fall into darkness no one saw coming. As the court date approached, both sides were quietly preparing their arsenal. Prosecutors were lining up testimonies from forensic pathologists, crime scene analysts, and first responders. They had subpoenaed digital records, GPS data, and even body cam footage from Oklahoma police to portray Gupta as evasive, calculating, and ultimately guilty. The defense, meanwhile, had begun building a case around context. They were seeking out character witnesses, preparing psychological evaluations, and gathering alternative interpretations of the autopsy findings. One source close to the defense suggested they might even allege that Aria's death was an accidental injury, a tragic fall, or medical episode that Neha panicked over and tried to cover up in a moment of sheer terror. In either case, the trial was shaping up to be an emotional minefield. A grieving mother, a dead child, forensic science, mental health, cultural dynamics, and a courtroom full of people trying to make sense of the unthinkable. And still, one question lingered like a shadow over it all. What really happened in that apartment? As July 26 passed, and the calendar drew inexorably toward August 7, little Aria Talathi was already gone. But she was everywhere, in headlines, in speculative podcasts, in courtroom filings, in whispered messages across the Indian American diaspora, and in the anxious eyes of the public awaiting justice or salvation in a case that felt too heavy for even the courtroom to bear. A child, a mother, and the weight of perception. Aria was just old enough to know princesses and giggle at bedtime stories. Her father, Dr. Saurabh Talathi, had once described her as the light of my life. To mourners, she was a bright spark snuffed out too early. To prosecutors, she became the silent center of a carefully orchestrated crime. Her mother, Dr. Neha Gupta, once revered, once respected, now stood accused. A pediatrician who had dedicated her life to children, an assistant professor at the University of Oklahoma College of Medicine. A mother caught between custody, career collapse, and rage or desperation. This case demanded a reckoning not just of evidence, but of how tragedy can fracture every bond we assume unbreakable. Grief versus guilt, a line too thin. At the heart of the case lies an unsettling possibility: how quickly the world turns when grief looks like guilt. One moment, Gupta was a parent confronting the worst nightmare imaginable. The next, she was a suspect. That pivot came fast, for authorities and for public opinion. Investigators allege motive rooted in custody, conflict, and financial strain. The defense framed the same facts as triggers for emotional collapse. In truth, both perspectives compressed complex human psychology into courtroom headlines and conspiracy-laden talk shows. Many wondered how long it took for grieving to become criminal. At what point did the line between sorrow and suspicion disappear? Forensic science as a sword and shield. When first responders pulled Aria from the pool, the tragedy looked like a drowning. But the medical examiner's preliminary findings shattered that illusion. Dry lungs, empty stomach, bruises inside her mouth. One blow after another to the narrative that Neha Gupta had offered. Behind every medical term lay a story. Waterless lungs. No trace that a child had inhaled water, even in final struggles. Empty stomach. Inconsistent with Gupta's own account of Aria eating hours before. Facial trauma. Bruises and lacerations on the face and mouth, needing explanation beyond slipping or rescue. To prosecutors, this was not just physical evidence. It was a declaration. This wasn't a drowning. It was staged. To the defense, however, the question became, are these markers incontrovertible or just interpretations? Independent forensic experts, the defense surmised, might reinterpret those bruise patterns. Laryngospasm, resuscitation complications, or even a seizure could influence findings. A single line of pathology, twisting in perspective, might alter meaning. Motive, custody, collapse, control. In many tragic family cases, the custody dispute becomes the narrative's hidden engine. In this case, the conflict had been high stakes. Divorce finalized in 2024. Bitter custody battle dragging into 2025. Court-ordered payments exceeding $79,000. Failed attempts at sole custody, despite legal filings and psychiatric evaluation requests. A protective order filed by Gupta, later dismissed an escalation, then silence. To prosecutors, this was motive. To the defense, it was trauma layered with hopelessness. Was the tragedy born of vengeance? or an emotional breakdown under unspeakable pressure. Public pulse. Divided, disturbed, determined. By the end of July, public reaction had fragmented sharply. Sympathy and doubt. Many in the Indian American community refused to believe a mother like Neha Gupta could harm her child. They recalled her generosity, her reputation, her community involvement. WhatsApp groups and vigil attendees spoke of loss, confusion, disbelief, fear, and conviction. Others saw the forensic findings as airtight. Social media buzzed with analysis: staged drowning, dry lungs, empty stomach, bruised face, clear case. Clergy-led groups urged justice for Aria, not excuses for Neha. Analysts and advocates, legal commentators critiqued the speed of charges. Mental health professionals warned against rushing to label a breakdown as homicide. Custody battle watchers echoed, "Motive isn't proof, that line requires evidence." Through it all, the only unanimous sentiment was pain. Pain for a 4-year-old. Pain for unanswered questions. A courtroom as arena. When August 7 arrived, it promised more than just a plea. Motions, scheduling arguments, disclosures, expert lists, all would be filed in public record. The arraignment was the gateway to a slow-motion collision of narratives. Prosecutors would demand admission of forensic testimony showing death preceded drowning, isolation of Neha's timeline, showing contradictory statements and delays, digital and surveillance evidence supporting premeditation. Defense attorneys would likely request full access to toxicology and pathology reports, allowance to introduce independent expert, accommodation for psychological evaluations, time to examine chain of custody and scene reconstruction. In short, the courtroom would become a theater not for performance, but for deep excavation of every claimed truth. Themes etched in silence. What this case reveals goes well beyond one tragedy. 1. The fragility of trust. Public trust in parents, especially mothers, can shatter overnight when assumptions and evidence collide. 2. The power of forensics. Medical science doesn't just explain death, it redefines narratives. What looked like drowning becomes suspect when pathology contradicts testimony. 3. The complexity of grief. Despair can look like premeditation. Without deep understanding and forensic nuance, emotional collapse may be misread as calculated violence. What remains unanswered? In the final days before trial, the unanswered questions loomed large. Could independent experts reinterpret the bruising and delay as non-homicidal phenomena? Would the court allow emotional trauma and professional collapse as part of the defense? Could motive rooted in family conflict be overshadowed by a nuance of psychological breakdown? And most haunting of all, was justice really possible in a system where timing, evidence, culture, and grief collided? Conclusion: a nation holds its breath. As the legal battle gears up, the nation, especially communities around Oklahoma City and Miami, waits. Waits for testimony. Waits for expert testimony. Waits for jury instructions. Waits for the closing arguments that may never satisfy. But in the silence between forensic exhibits, between character witnesses, between legal motions, Aria Talathi remains the only speaker who cannot testify. Her voice exists now only in echo, in tears, in speculation. This case lays bare something darker than the crime itself: the thin line between grief and suspicion, the way forensic science can reshape initial assumptions, turning drowning into murder. The complexity of motive when custody conflicts, career collapse, and child death intersect. It also underscores how quickly a tragedy can turn a grieving parent into a defendant, especially when timing fails, physical evidence conflicts, and statements diverge. Investigators build their case. The public watches, and some hope, some fear, that trial will bring closure, while others believe it may only deepen the wound. In the end, the truth waits in a Miami courtroom on August 7 and beyond. It waits in expert testimony and cross-examination. It waits in the silence of Aria's empty arms. And above all, it waits in the question no court has yet answered. What happened that night in El Portal?